The beard is luscious. Hey guys, my name is Matt Johnson. I'm a wedding cinematographer and I've been shooting weddings for about 5.5 years now. About a month ago, my friend Chris recommended that I start making videos featuring reviews and tips for wedding cinematographers to help them get better. And I was like, well, I've been shooting weddings for a while. I kind of know what I'm doing. So I tried it out and I made a review of the Sony a7S II for wedding films. If you haven't seen the video yet, it goes pretty in depth into the a7S II, what's good about it, what's bad about it, and really especially if you should use it for shooting wedding films. So if you're a wedding cinematographer, I would highly recommend checking it out. But the a7S isn't really what we're going to be talking about today. Well, a little bit, but mostly we're going to be talking about this, the Sony FS5, which is a pretty cool new camera. We're going to look at the pros and cons of this camera, and more importantly, if you should use it to shoot a wedding. So with that, let's jump right in. For the past 3.5 years, I've been shooting pretty much exclusively with the FS100. And a solid camera, incredibly usable with a great image. Not long after the FS100 came out, the FS700 came out, and it had two key benefits over the FS100. One, it had built-in ND filters. Two, it could shoot in super slow motion at up to 240 frames per second in full HD. Sony has continued to improve their cameras though, and prices have continued to drop. So now, instead of spending $8,000 on the Sony FS700 that shoots 1080p, you can spend $8,000 on an FS7 that shoots 4K, or $5,600 on an FS5 that shoots 4K, or $3,000 on an A7S that shoots 4K. A few months ago, Sony announced they were discontinuing the FS100 and going to be replacing it with a new camera. This camera ended up being the FS5, and it actually goes above the FS100 in the hierarchy, so now it's FS700 for $4,000, FS5 for $5,600, FS7 for $8,000, and on more and more expensive. With a little bit of the background out of the way, let's talk about the hardware of this camera. Specifically, it is really well built. With every iteration of Sony F-series of cameras, they've seemed to improve the buttons and layouts and ergonomics. The FS100 was basically a box with a handle. The FS700 was a box with a nicer handle. The FS7 was a rounded box you could put on your shoulder with a nice handle. The FS5 continues this trend with even more improvements. So now you get a nice rounded box with a side handle and a top handle, and it's pretty ergonomic regardless of whether you're holding it on the side or on the top. This is one of the first Sony cameras I used that really feels like it was made to be held for a long extended period of time. It really feels like they put a lot of work into making it usable all day. So if you're running around shooting in a city or in the country or something like that and you don't have it on a tripod all day, you'll be perfectly all right carrying it around, putting it on a monopod, putting it on a glide cam, having it in your hands all day. Next we'll talk about the menu, but to talk about the menu we need to turn it on. And this thing turns on super fast, which is great. Flip the power switch, watch the LCD screen. We're on and ready to record that quickly. Sony says it's 2 seconds. I think it's closer to 3. But regardless, whenever you're shooting a wedding or another event, you will need to be able to get your camera up and running quickly to capture something. So it's really nice to be able to have the camera off, not doing anything, waiting for something to happen. As soon as you see something about to start happening, you can turn on the camera, start recording instantly, which is really helpful. The menu itself is incredibly similar to the FS100 and FS700. So whenever you hit the button, you still have all of the camera settings, the recording settings, the audio settings, the display settings. There's more features in there, but it's still the same menu that pops up and you have a scroll wheel to access it. In addition to the scroll wheel, you also now have a joystick on the handle that you can use to manipulate the menu, go forward and backward, make selections much quicker than just using the little scroll wheel. Also, this thing is incredibly modular. You can take the top handle off, you can take the side handle off, you can still mount the viewfinder onto the top of the camera in all these different mounting points. So you have a lot of options. If you need to strip this thing down, stick it on a Movi, stick it on a glide cam, stick it on something where it needs to be very small in a very tight space. Now that we've talked about the body a little bit, let's talk about the video quality. Specifically, you'll notice this thing says 4K, which means that it can record 4K internally, which is awesome. It'll do 4K at up to 30 frames per second at 420 8-bit color, which isn't as impressive as say the FS7 at 10-bit color, but it's still really beautiful and a great resolution if you need to punch in, manipulate the image, stabilize things, etc. This is also the point in the video where I'm going to start comparing this thing to the a7S II. Specifically, the a7S II and this camera both record the same type of 4K. So it's going to be the same resolution, same 420 color space. The FS5 uses a different codec, which we'll talk about in a minute, but otherwise it is essentially the same. Also, the camera itself will go up to 32,000 ISO, which it gets pretty grainy once it hits that point, so you probably won't want to use it that high, but up to 16 it still looks great. Is it as good as the A7S II? No, but it's still really great. And this wouldn't be an FS series camera review if I didn't talk about the slow motion. This camera has the exact same slow motion capabilities that the Sony FS700 does. So up to 240 frames per second at 1080p. It'll do 120 frames per second at 1080p also. You can do 480 frames per second at 720p, 960 at standard definition. So exact same setup as the FS700. You record it to a buffer, which then saves to the memory card. There is one caveat of this camera though that's a pretty big one that makes it different from the FS700. On the FS700, whenever you want to shoot in super slow motion, all you have to do is hit the S and Q button, and you hit it twice. You hit it once, it'll go to 60 frames per second. You hit it again, it'll go to 240 frames per second. That's the default settings, you can customize that. That is where the comparisons between the FS700 and this camera end though, because now we're going to talk about one of the biggest cons of this camera that I've found. Specifically, when you're shooting with the FS700 in its default settings, you would hit the S and Q button twice to go from shooting at regular speed to super slow motion. You hit it once, it'll go to 60 frames per second. Twice, it's going to go to 240 frames per second. Then you would start recording as normally. With this camera, if you are recording in 4K, which you probably will be because that's why you would buy a camera like this, is to shoot 4K. If you hit the S and Q button and you are recording 4K, it will not go to 240 frames per second in HD because that requires changing settings in the menu. What will only happen is if you hit the S and Q button, it will switch from recording at 24 frames per second to 30 frames per second, which is not super slow motion by any stretch of the imagination. This is one of the first major cons of this camera for if you're shooting a wedding. These are the steps that you'll have to take if you want to go from recording at 4K, 24 frames per second, to 1080p at 240 frames per second. You're going to hit the menu button. You're going to go into your recording settings. You're going to click in on file format. Change the file format to XABC HD. The camera is going to say that it's executing. Then you're going to click OK. Then you're going to hit the menu button. Now you hit the S and Q button. And it'll say 60 frames per second. You hit it again, it'll say 240 frames per second, super slow motion. And then that's to prepare if you're shooting end trigger or start trigger. But my point with this is, if you are planning on buying this camera because you want to be able to quickly change back and forth between shooting 4K and 1080p. Let's say you're shooting a wedding and you want to record the bride throwing the bouquet at 240 frames per second. Get that slow effect as it's flying through the air and the bridesmaids are trying to catch it and dive for it. It's pretty cool. But the problem with this camera is that if you're trying to change and get to those settings quickly, it takes about 30 seconds to get through it. It just feels a little strange to me that this camera is built to be run and gun, but they didn't actually make it so that you can just use the S and Q button and get right to 240 frames per second at 1080p. Instead, you have to dive through the menu settings to get to it to change it. And I've dug through this camera and that's the only way I can see how to do it. So if you have some magical way to make it quicker, that'd be great. But as it is, the menus are quite a bit to dig through if you're trying to switch quickly between 4K and 1080p to shoot super slow motion, which I know a lot of people want to do. So keep that in mind. If you're considering getting this camera for shooting weddings and you want to shoot a lot of slow motion, be aware of the gap in time that it will take you to change settings in the menu. Now compared to the A7S, that camera can record 120 frames per second for as long as you want with no buffer. That's definitely a pro for the A7S over the FS5, even though the A7S can only do 120 frames per second, not 240. Let's talk about codecs and S-Log, which are two pretty big things about this camera. This camera records in XAVC-L, which is different from the A7S II and the FS7. The A7S II records in XAVC-S, and the FS7 records in XAVC-I. XAVC-L is kind of in the middle, and L stands for long GOP, which is a complicated video term, which basically means that the camera is hyper efficient in what it records, so you get smaller file sizes with good quality, but at the same time, you take a hit for it in processing power. And everything that I've read and seen and experienced is you need a pretty beefy computer to be able to edit this footage from this camera. A little bit more beefy than footage with the A7S II or the FS7. But you do get great image quality for the file size. Is it better quality than the A7S II? I can't really say because I haven't done any in-depth image quality tests between the two. From everything that I've seen editing both of their footages, they both look incredibly similar to me. The good news is that Sony is now putting S-Log and Cinegammas into all of their video cameras, so it's now very easy to match up footage even whenever you shoot it with multiple cameras. Having shot with the A7S for a few weddings and with this camera for one wedding, I would not recommend using this camera in S-Log 3 mode, mainly because you end up with banding if you try to color grade it too much because it's only an 8-bit camera. Instead, I would recommend using the Cinegammas. Specifically, I use Cinegamma 4 with the S-Gamma 3 color space. So you still end up with the newest color science that Sony makes, but without the banding issues that come from shooting with such a flat image. Now here's a weird con of this camera that you're gonna run into more if you're a wedding cinematographer. And I did not run into this whenever I was using the A7S II, so it's a little weird. But if you are shooting an S-Gamma 3, you have to select the white balance that you'll be using in the picture profile. You cannot select a custom white balance. So your white balances are limited to 3200K, 4300K, or 5200K, which is odd. And from what I've read about it online, Sony scientists are saying, well, it's a mathematical issue because we're trying to give you the best color. We have the math dialed in perfectly for these three settings. And so if you were shooting in a room that has weird lighting and it doesn't really match any of those three, you're gonna have to just try to match it as close as you can to like 5200K or 3200K, and then you're gonna have to grade it in post to bring it back to that if you're shooting an S-Gamma 3. Now the weird thing about that is that on the A7S II, if I want to change the white balance, regardless of if I'm shooting S-Gamma 3, S-Log, anything like that, I can set the white balance to whatever I want without having to go into the picture profiles to do it. I don't really know why they're enforcing that decision on the FS5, but not on the A7S II. So to clarify, if you are wanting to change the white balance and you're shooting an S-Gamma 3, you're going to need to press the picture profile button, go to your picture profile, go to settings, go down to color mode, and select either S-Gamma 3 scene 3200K, 4300K, or 5500K, which is really weird. I don't know why you can't just set that in white balance. What I've done to work around that is I actually set picture profile 1, picture profile 2, and picture profile 3 to all the same picture profile, Cine 4, S-Gamma 3 scene, but for each one of them, the first one I made, S-Gamma 3 scene 3200K, the second one was 4300K, and the third one was 5500K. And that is one way around it if you need to be able to change your white balance quickly. So be aware that if you're shooting S-Log, you cannot set a custom white balance. You're limited to 3 presets. This isn't as much of an issue if you're shooting a corporate video or a movie with this camera, because you can set up the lights and have everything balanced perfectly just as you want. But whenever you're shooting a wedding, you don't have nearly as much control over the light. So I do really wish you could set a custom white balance in this camera, and I'm bummed that it's not included like it is on the A7S II. On to lenses. I already went in depth about the lenses I'm using in my Sony A7S II review, so I won't go super in depth here. Just know that I'm using Sigma Art lenses with Nikon mounts and using a photodiox adapter to adapt them to the Sony E-mount. The benefit of the Sony E-mount though is that you can use pretty much any lens ever with it, which is really awesome. You can adapt Canon, Nikon, Olympus, Leica, Fujifilm. I don't know, you have a ton of options. Just know that, which is really, really great. One super cool feature of this camera though is that regardless of which lens you are using, you can turn on in the menu an option called Clear Image Zoom, which actually lets you turn any lens that you have into a zoom lens, regardless of whether it's prime or not. And it's doing this through some complicated math by zooming the sensor in. It's basically a digital image zoom, which if you have an iPhone and you've tried to zoom in, it looks terrible if you're using the zoom on that. But Sony, through their wizardry, have made this with no discernible loss in quality. So there's really no reason not to use it. The benefit of it is that you use the little zoom rocker here and you get a 1.5x zoom. So it's really helpful if you are shooting, say, the bride getting ready and you're like, oh, I wish I could be just a little bit closer, but I'm only on a 50mm. Now you can get in just a little bit closer, which is really, really nice. Or if you're running around with the glide cam and you're like, this is just a little bit too wide, I want to be a little bit tighter, you can now do that with this camera, which is amazing. It also works with Sony zoom lenses. So you can actually use the rocker to zoom in optically with the lens, and then once it reaches the end of the lens's zoom, it will zoom even further. If my math is right, the clear image zoom will turn your 50mm into a 50 to 75mm, and your 70 to 200mm into a 70 to 300mm, which is really nice if you're stuck up in the balcony at the back of some church 3 miles away from the couple. One other con of this camera though that I really wish that Sony had taken from the a7S II and put in it is the image stabilization. This camera does not have internal image stabilization like the a7S II. So you are limited to using either Sony lenses with image stabilization or Canon lenses with image stabilization if you have a live adapter. Otherwise, you're not going to get image stabilization. So just be aware of that if you're glide camming or using a monopod or shooting handheld especially, and you want things to be super stable. If you're shooting the a7S II, you can shoot handheld without a problem. With this camera, you're probably going to want to at least have a monopod just to make sure you're stable enough. Let's get on to one of the most amazing pieces of technological witchcraft that Sony put into this thing, and that is the variable electronic ND filter. With previous cameras like the FS700, C100, and C300, you were limited to 3 analog ND filter settings, 1/4, 1/16, and 1/64. You could switch between those 3, but whenever you were, say, going from inside to outside, like at a wedding where you're filming a couple indoors and they're like, let's go outdoors, you would have your NDs off indoors, but then as soon as you step outdoors, you would have to turn on the ND, then you would have to adjust the aperture to match the sky outside so you're still not too overexposed, and then you have to adjust the ISO too. You would still have to adjust those 3 things. Now, with the electronic variable ND, you really only ever need to think about the ND filter. Once you have your aperture and ISO dialed in, you can now electronically adjust the ND to whatever brightness level you want. So you still have to turn the ND on, turn it from clear to 1. The cool thing is that you now have an electronic variable ND, meaning that a little piece of glass comes up that's electronically charged that will brighten or dim electronically instead of having 3 different NDs. So you still have your presets, clear, 1, 2, and 3. But you can now change those presets to be whatever you want. You can make preset 1, 1/4, preset 2, 1/8, and preset 2, 1/28, whatever you want. But the other benefit of it is that you can switch from preset mode to variable mode, and then using either this scroll wheel here on the side or the scroll wheel on the handle, you can customize that to adjust your ND, anywhere from 1/4 ND all the way up to 1/128 ND, which is super dark. And you can change the ND without adjusting any other settings. So you don't have to fiddle with the aperture and ISO. You only have to adjust your ND. And it's super smooth too, to the point that if you're going from inside to outside and you want to adjust the ND, you can be rotating the scroll wheel on the camera and it is so smooth. It's almost like you have a clickless aperture adjustment. You can now adjust everything electronically exactly how you want without having to worry about your aperture or ISO. And this is fantastic if you're shooting a wedding because you usually have a lot of things on your mind, and so instead of having to think about aperture, ISO, white balance, ND, you're really only thinking about your ND and white balance whenever you're changing locations or spots. I'm expecting to see this on most cameras in the future because it's just such a cool feature. This camera takes the same memory cards as the a7S II. I would recommend using the same memory cards that I recommend using in the a7S II. I've been using SanDisk 95 megabits per second cards, 128 gigabyte and 256 gigabyte, and they've been great. The nice thing about this camera though is that you can record 2 memory cards in either relay or at the same time. So you could be recording 2 cards at the same time and have one of them be a backup in case you had a card fail. Or you can do relay mode where you have it fill up one memory card and then instantly switch over to the other memory card and continue recording as normal. So the benefit of that is that instead of you having to buy one big 256 gig card to get you through a wedding day, you could buy 2 128 gig cards that are cheaper and use both of those in relay and still film an entire wedding. Audio-wise, this camera is great. It has a lot of features for that. You have a built-in microphone on the handle, and it also has a mount for you to put a shotgun mic. So if you have an old FS100 or FS700, this mount will actually fit your old mic, so you can just use that if you want to. As far as quality of sound, I don't think that the mic on the handle is as good as the mic that came on the FS700, but it'll still work for picking up scratch audio whenever you need it. But if you want higher quality shotgun audio, I would recommend getting a small shotgun mic to put on here for recording. The camera also has dual XLR inputs, one on the handle and one on the body, so even if you're shooting without the handle, you can still record audio. This is very helpful if you're shooting the wedding ceremony and you want to record the lapel mic directly into the camera so you don't have to sync it up in post. Battery life is something that I talked about a lot with the A7S, and this camera is going to be a little different, a little bit shorter. Specifically, this camera uses batteries that have been around since the F3 days. So if you've ever shot with an F3 or an FS7, it will use the same batteries, which is incredibly helpful. But if you're coming from the FS100 or FS700, it uses a different battery that's not compatible. This uses the BP series of batteries. They make a BPU 30, BPU 60, and BPU 90. It comes with a BPU 30, which will give you about 3 hours of recording time. Just remember the 3 if you're wondering about hours. The BPU 60 is about 6 hours, and the BPU 90 is about, I guess, 9 hours. I don't have one, but just so you know, battery size wise, this is the BPU 30 battery. I would say it's about the size of 2 Canon LPE6 batteries, and it gives you a pretty good runtime with this camera. But if you're shooting a wedding all day and you don't want to be dealing with charging batteries and changing batteries all the time, I would definitely recommend looking into getting 2 of the BPU 60 batteries. 1 BPU 60 will get you through most of the day. 2 BPU 60s will get you through the entire day, no problem. Another nice benefit of it is that it will tell you how much battery life is left on the battery. Now, a con of these batteries is that they are expensive. The BPU 60 is $270 on B&H, which is pretty expensive, and the BPU 90 is like $400. So consider it an investment. I would buy a few just to make sure you make it through the whole day of shooting. Now we get to the part that I'm sure everybody wants to hear about, and it is, should you buy the FS5 or the A7S? Because the A7S is $3,000, the FS5 is $5,600. It's a pretty big chunk of change. So let's talk about reasons you should get the FS5 over the A7S. First off, it has built-in ND filters, so you don't need to worry about getting a variable ND filter to put on the end of the lens or buy a lens adapter that has an ND filter built in. The NDs are already in the camera. Whatever lens you use on it, you have NDs built in, and they can get dark enough where even on the brightest day, you can be fully wide open on your lens and still have it dark enough that you're not overexposed. Secondly, better battery life. On the A7S II, I told you guys I run through about 3 to 4 batteries per wedding. On this camera, you can get through with 1 or 2 completely fine. Just remember that these batteries do way more than the A7S II batteries, so if you're carting around the A7S II batteries like that big, this battery is pretty big. So in the battery life war, this camera definitely wins. Just remember that if you're spending $270 on a BPU 60 battery for this camera, you could be getting 5 A7S II batteries. Another reason you should get the FS5 is the dual memory card slots. You're safer when you're recording. If your memory card fails, you'll have a backup if you're recording mirrored, or at the very least, you can still record a longer time. Granted, if you had 2 256 gig cards, you could record for over 10 hours in 4K, but I don't think you'd want to have to edit through all that footage. This camera also has 2 XLR inputs. The A7S has none, meaning that if you want to record audio on the A7S, you need to use an external recorder that has XLR inputs, like a Zoom H6. With this camera, you don't have to worry about an external audio recorder. You can record directly into the camera and monitor your audio as you film. Lastly, this camera can record 240 frames per second at 1080p for 8-second bursts. The A7S is limited to 120 frames per second, but it can do unlimited length recording. So still a reason to buy it if you want 240 frames per second at 1080p or 480 frames per second at 720p. Those are the reasons that I like the FS5 more than the A7S. Now let's talk about reasons why I like the A7S more than the FS5. First off, the A7S is about 1/3 of the weight of this camera. This is an incredibly light camera for a cinema camera. It weighs less than my FS100 did, and it has built-in NDs and a ton of technology, and it records at 4K. But with a lens, it still weighs a decent amount, and you're gonna get an arm workout throughout the day. The A7S is about 1/3 of the weight of this camera, and even with the lens on it, it's still incredibly light to carry around, so that's a definite win for the A7S too. Secondly, the A7S has built-in image stabilization, which this camera does not have. So if you're wanting to shoot handheld with this camera, your best bet is really with an image stabilized lens. Otherwise, I would be using a monopod. Another pro for the A7S II is that the menus are a little quicker to navigate. Neither menu system on the A7S II or the FS5 are ideal, but I did find it a little bit quicker to navigate through the A7S menus. Because of the quicker menu settings of the A7S II, I can flip one preset switch and go from shooting 4K at 24 frames per second to shooting 1080p at 120 frames per second. And I don't have to wait on the buffer to load. I don't have to go through complicated menus to get to it. It's literally just one flip of a switch and I'm shooting slow motion. When you're shooting a wedding, that's incredibly helpful because things happen so fast at weddings and you want to be able to capture the best moments. So I may want something in slow motion, but right after that, I want something back at 24p. So I need to be able to switch back and forth between the two of them very quickly. I feel like it goes without saying that the A7S II is also better in low light than the FS5. And I really do love the high ISO ability because whenever I'm shooting a wedding reception that's super dark, I want to be able to crank up the ISO as high as I need to go without it getting too grainy and unusable. The A7S II can also set a custom white balance when shooting an S-Gamut 3 scene. So instead of having to change the white balance in the picture profile to one of 3 presets, I can quickly dial in the white balance to whatever I want and it still looks great. I'm sure there's some Sony engineer somewhere pulling out his hair because I'm changing his perfect math that he's used for those 3 presets. But I'm shooting a wedding, I'm not in a studio, I need to be able to set my white balance just as I need to very quickly. So what'll you do? Lastly, the A7S II is a full frame sensor, while the FS5 is a super 35mm sensor. So with the FS5, you're going to need to use a speed booster if you want to bring it back up to full frame size. So let's recap. Overall, the FS5 is an amazing cinematographer's dream camera. It has the same sensor as the FS7 for nearly $3,000 cheaper. It has a small body, it's compact, it's ergonomic, it's actually fun to hold. When shooting with the FS100 or FS700, I always kind of felt like I was fighting against the camera to make sure I was holding it properly. With this camera, it is a dream to hold. And if you have an FS7 already, this would be an amazing B camera for it. But I do doubt that you're shooting weddings with an FS7 because it weighs over twice as much as this camera, and you probably don't want to be carrying that around all day. So if you want a camera that shoots 4K internally, has these crazy witchcraft variable electronic ND settings that you can set to whatever you want so you can shoot in super bright light still wide open. If you want beautiful built-in XLR inputs, if you want to make your prime lenses zoom lenses, which I never thought that I would say, and you want an all-in package that's light enough to carry around all day, this is a great camera. I would highly recommend it over the FS700. It's better in every way, and don't even talk to me about the C100 because this camera completely mops the floor with it in every sense of the word. But does it beat the A7S II? And that is the really hard thing for me because at this point, I'm already in love with the A7S II. Whenever I think about what camera I want to grab to do something, I go to the A7S II because it's lighter and quicker. And if you're shooting weddings specifically, I don't believe, and this is me personally, I don't believe the FS5 is worth the $2,600 more than the A7S II. Because think about it, between the A7S II and the FS5, you're getting the same video quality. It's still 420 8-bit at 4K up to 30 frames per second. They both have S-Log built in with wide dynamic range. So it all really comes down to the additional features that each camera offers and the pros and cons that I listed earlier in the video. And if the FS5 had a little bit more going for it, then I would love it. Like if it recorded 10-bit 4K, or if it recorded 4K at 60 frames per second even. If it was just slightly better. The problem is that I know that if Sony did it, they would cannibalize their FS7 sales, so they're not going to do that. I would even consider the FS5 more if it had better menus. If I didn't have to go into the settings to change to super slow motion, or change the white balance in the picture profile menu. But the problem is that because I'm shooting weddings, and I need to change things quickly. I need to adjust settings as fast as I can to get to the next thing. I need a camera that can change settings incredibly quickly and be simple to use. As it is, this camera does not have enough pros for me over the A7S for me to justify spending the money on it. So as much as it pains me, this guy's going back to B&H next week, and I'm going to be ordering another A7S II to shoot weddings with for the foreseeable future. At least until next year when they come out with an A7S III probably. My wife's gonna kill me. Thanks for watching this video. I really hope that it was informative and that it helped you make a decision about which one of these cameras to buy. I'm hoping to do some more review videos like this in the future, but there probably won't be any camera reviews for a while because my wife will murder me if I buy another camera right away. But with that, I'm still hoping to do other videos to help people get better at wedding cinematography. Thanks so much for watching. You can watch more of my videos at whoismatt.com, or you can visit my wedding film site, Filmstrong Productions, at filmstrong.com. Thanks and have a great day.